morning. It's a pleasure to be here. First of all, just want to note that I am a New Englander, although I work at the national and international level. I was born in Connecticut, raised there, and now live in Rhode Island. So while I'm so appreciative and admire a lot the work that all of the compacts have done, it is a special pleasure to be invited here to be with all of you by Nebby and the amazing team that put on this wonderful event. So my role here is to help set the stage for the conversation for the rest of the day. And in setting the stage, I'm going to share a lot of information that some of you may already know and know well, and some of you may not know yet about open education, the issues around higher education course materials, the challenges that students face, how open education is making that better, and how the changing landscape is going to start impacting the conversations we're having around this in the future. So I'm going to start by laying out just some key questions that we'll address. So first, just looking at how we got into this situation in the first place with textbooks being expensive. We'll discuss what exactly open educational resources are and what they are not. And we'll talk about some examples of how OER is benefiting students across the country. And then finally, talk a little bit about the other models that you may be hearing about on your campus and some strategies to address those. So I want to start by going way back into the 1900s, as the kids on TikTok say, way back when the world was such that in order to educate a student, you had to print and ship a book to them in order to do that. And textbooks sort of grew up within institutions as an ancillary product that was served by campus bookstores and the publishing industry, which existed because it had to work that way when you had to print and ship knowledge. And we don't live in that world anymore. We live in a very different world. And I think it's important to trace the through line of how the model that was developed for the analog world is presenting itself in the digital world. So we've all seen some version of this graph, I'm sure. This is textbook prices going back to 2001. So the last 20 or so years where prices have more than doubled. And over this time, and so I started college in 2003, and I thought my textbooks were expensive. And that's at the very beginning of this graph. So the textbook market has really driven an affordability crisis for students getting access to materials, but it's changed. So back when I was in college, this is the experience that I had. I would go into the bookstore, find the books that were assigned to me. You know, I might be able to go online and buy things on eBay, but you sort of had to go to the bookstore to find your books. So that was sort of the very beginning of e-commerce, which started to change the way textbooks were bought and sold. Over time, things started to move online a little bit more. We saw the textbook industry start combating the growth of e-commerce in the sales of used books, which actually were reducing the number of books that they were selling because more students could get used books. So they started employing all of these different types of tactics. This is an example of a textbook bundle where you can get the economics in the movies instant access code along with this $167.95 economics textbook from 2008. Right, and keep in mind that prices have doubled since then. And is the bottom cut off? Oh, sorry about that. I've cut you guys off. All right. So these access codes sort of limited the ability of students to be able to resell textbooks. I still remember one of my textbooks had a CD in the back that I lost, and I couldn't sell the book back. I got like $3 for a $150 logic textbook. And we all have these stories. It's a huge frustration. And over time, it's evolved. You know, in the 2010s, we started to see some legislation, federal legislation took effect that required publishers to unbundle textbooks and offer those components for sale separately, and required some price transparency requirements for institutions, making sure that they're putting on the course schedule students use for registration information about what books they're being assigned, so they don't have to go to the bookstore and write down the ISBN and search for it on eBay. And over time, we started to see a shift toward more digital options. So it wasn't just these access codes that were being stuck into textbooks, but actual digital books being sold as alternative to print. This is an example from the mid-2010s of a $103.99 physics textbook that you get for 180 days. Physics is a 2-semester course typically, so you can't fit 2 semesters in 180 days, so I'm not sure what the plan is here, but publishers actually saw that students were very heavily still sticking with the used books and rental options that the secondary market provided over the digital options that they were offering. Even though theoretically the prices were lower, theoretically they were digital rentals, theoretically this is the generation of digital natives, or at least a large portion of students were at the time. And I think in 2017, things started to shift a little bit in terms of what publishers were offering. So, and I think this was the year of the $400 textbook, and I really love this slide in this example, because it's a Principles of Economics textbook. It's the same one I showed you in the first slide. $406 to buy that printed book. Like, that is outrageous. And then you can see the publishers have started to offer things like renting, which previously publishers didn't offer that. They let the secondary market take care of that. So the publishing industry did respond to the pressures, but not in ways that innovated or improved the situation for students. But you can still see these digital options, and even in 2017, a small portion of students were buying those. And now if you look at this from 2020, this is what a student might see when they go to their bookstore. So it's not a choice like you saw in the last slide. This is an example of what's called inclusive access, and we're going to get to this, we're going to come back to this at the end. But in this case, the digital textbook is being automatically charged to the student's tuition bill. So this is one of those digital textbooks for $110, and the institution has struck a deal with the publisher and the bookstore to just automatically bill that to students. So, and under federal regulations, students should have the right to opt out, but this is the way that the market is going in terms of where the publishing industry is pushing things. So I think this context is really important to enter into our conversation about OER, because we need to understand the market that we're working with. So the textbook publishing market, this market that developed around the idea of needing to print and ship books, is a near monopoly. 3 companies hold 80% of the market: Pearson, Cengage, McGraw-Hill. Similarly, the college bookstore operating industry is dominated by 2 companies, Follett and Barnes & Noble. And then it's approximately a third between those 2 companies and independent stores. And the other thing about this market to understand is that the supply-demand dynamics don't work the way they're supposed to, because at the end of the day, students are a captive market. They're required to buy whatever material faculty assign. And for the last 20 years, it was a situation where students could at least go out and shop around for lower cost options. All of these programs emerged on campus to help students get access to the library, to loaned copies. And now that's starting to change, where students don't even have a choice of where they're going to buy their books. So as we understand the challenges that we're facing, understanding that these market dynamics underlie all of the conversations that are happening about course materials are important. And I want to note that nothing I am saying right now is controversial. The textbook industry has admitted this. This is a quote from, oh, what happened there? Let's try that again. Okay. This is a quote from the CEO of Cengage that basically just admits that, they just increased prices over and over again in response to the fact that they were selling less books because of used books, and students didn't have a choice. And I think as we're thinking about how do we solve this problem, understanding the impacts that this has had. So, and again, we've all seen statistics like this. 2 in 3 students say they've decided against buying a textbook because the cost is too high. 1 in 5 students say they've dropped a course because the cost of textbooks is too high. 1 in 10 students say that they've skipped meals due to the cost of textbooks. This problem is having a real impact on students' ability to complete their education. Even if you look at the overall cost of education, textbooks aren't the largest part of it, but they are a very significant one, and they can often be the straw that breaks the camel's back in terms of what students are able to get out of their education, because if they don't have access to their textbooks, they're not going to be able to learn the same way that their peers are. So at the end of the day, students can't learn from materials they can't afford. All right, so we're going to shift gears and talk about open educational resources and how the work of the open education movement is working to solve this problem. So this acronym OER, Open Educational Resources, is the term that was coined by UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Science, and Cultural Organization in 2002, I believe. And what it means is educational materials of any kind in any format that are 2 things, has a very specific meaning. So first, they are free, and so free of cost, free to access, free of barriers. And 2, that they are coupled with legal permission to reuse the material in all of the ways that are possible on the internet. So taking a step away from the way that textbooks have always worked in terms of printing and shipping books, and thinking about this material as knowledge that can be improved, shaped, localized in the way that education should work. And when we talk about this legal permission, we talk about this in terms of the 5R framework that was invented by Dr. David Wiley. So when we talk about legal permission for open educational resources, we talk about the right to retain the material, so to keep and control a copy forever, so there's no 180-day expiration date. The right to reuse the material, so to use it in any context that you want. The right to revise and remix it, which means to take copies of materials, sort of make it your own, add your own examples, mix and match chapters or assets together. And then finally, the right to redistribute, so to reshare whatever you've created with it. And in terms of the legal framework for those permissions, there's an organization called Creative Commons that's published licenses that make it very easy for anybody, anywhere, to put basically change the default terms of copyright, which are all rights reserved. You know, we've seen that on, every copyrighted piece of work you've ever encountered. Creative Commons is sort of like some rights reserved, where you permit the 5R permissions while reserving the right to be attributed for your work, which we all know is very important. So encourage you to check out Creative Commons' website, lots of great information there. All right, so let's talk about an example of an open educational resource. So I'm going to point out OpenStax, which is a project out of Rice University. Michael mentioned it earlier. It's essentially an open textbook publisher that's produced over 40 open textbooks that are very high quality. They look, feel, and act like a traditional textbook, except they are open, meaning that they are free, so free of cost and free of barriers, distributed online. And they are open, meaning that they have a Creative Commons license on them. So this is an example of principles of economics, and you can see on their website, you have a lot of choices here. You can view the material online, you can download a PDF, you can order a print copy, you can go to Bookshare, which has an audio version of this book, or you can download it on different apps. And the other thing you can do is actually get a print copy of these books. So just like any other textbook, there are copies of them on Amazon. You can get them directly from OpenStax, and I found this in the trunk of my car, but I didn't think I had one. But so this, and I don't know if anybody can see me right now, but wherever the camera is, this looks a little picture on the side there. Yes, okay. So this looks like any other textbook. It's physics, so I don't know what any of this says, but it has color images. This is like $40 to $50 to print a hard copy of the book. But the great thing is that if you don't want a hard copy of the book, you can read it for free online. You can print out chapters on your own computer, or just the sections that you want to read. You can put it on your phone, and there are no limits on what you can do, the way there are with commercial materials. So I'm happy to pass this around if anybody wants to check it out in the room. It's heavy. But I think showing this example is really great because it shows you what's possible. So this is inside the textbook. This is one of the chapters. I picked elasticity in pricing because inelasticity of demand is the economic concept that explains why textbook prices have risen so much. So, you know, and if you had to buy the $400 economics textbook, you may not know that. But you can go read this for free right now. So, you know, if I were a professor and assign this to my students, so I could do that. But, you know, if I wanted to like make my own copy of this chapter for my students, I could go in there and create an example in this chapter and just sort of add it in that talks about the textbook market and why textbooks are so expensive, if that's the information that I want to teach my students. And the OpenStax project is just awesome. This article is from a few years ago, actually, so it's even more now. But nearly half of US colleges are using OpenStax textbooks. And the most recent Bayview Analytics report basically considers OpenStax one of the largest publishers in the country. So it's a, you know, a fabulously successful project focused on introductory courses. So I'll talk about a few other examples of OER that's out there. So there's this great project out of the University of Minnesota called the Open Textbook Library, which lists over 900 open textbooks. Is it over 1,000 now? I can't remember. Over 1,000, over 1,000 open textbooks, which is wild because when I started working on this issue as a student advocate in 2006, there were 5. And now there's over 1,000. And this is a great resource. So if you take sort of one easy thing away from this talk, this is a resource to share with your faculty and your campus. You can go and search by subject. There's information on all of the books and where you can find them, all of the different formats. It's very, very faculty friendly. There are also examples of OER projects that are looking at sort of smaller pieces of learning materials. So this, the FET project out of the University of Colorado, build simulations for STEM courses. So they have really award-winning simulations that you can insert into any digital material. And actually some of the traditional publishers use these too because they're openly licensed. So OER can be very small and they can be very big in terms of textbooks or even full courses. And there are a few online repositories where you can search just all of the OER that's out there. It can be a little bit overwhelming. If you feel overwhelmed by it, talk to a librarian. But this is another great resource, OER Commons. You can search for any subject, any type of material. You can look, you know, some of them are based on state standards if you're in K-12 or in some cases higher ed. This is another wonderful resource if you just want to go out there and find open stuff. And remember, it's not just about sharing free stuff. This is also about enabling new types of teaching and learning that can be more engaging for students and that can take full advantage of all of the things that we're able to do in the digital environment that were never possible in the analog world when your textbook only looked like wherever that book is at this point. So an example that I love, and hat tip to Dr. Robin DeRosa, is the Open Anthology of Earlier American Literature. So this is great because all of the materials that have expired copyright, so you know, older materials, are all in the public domain. So those are all open because you can freely use them. And this is an anthology of materials from early America where the copyright has expired. It's an online book where Dr. DeRosa used a plugin called Hypothesis that allows students to annotate the text. So rather than making them buy an expensive annotated version of a book, there's a collaborative process where students can go in and comment on each other's comments and be able to interact with the material in a way that's never been possible before. And I think it's just a wonderful example of the kinds of things that open enables. Another great example, so this is the work of Cynthia Roscoe, who's a librarian at East LA College. She just finished a Sparks Leadership Program, actually, and her capstone project was focused on hyper-localization of content. So specifically looking at the East LA context in which her students are learning and thinking about things like changing out the names of grocery stores and word problems in math, or thinking about, in language text, like, why are we talking, like, what kind of fruit are we talking about? And is this fruit relevant in the city that we're living in? And, why aren't we talking about things that, are grown here? And I think it's a really great example of thinking not just about how do we make materials more relevant for students overall, but thinking about what's unique about the student population and the surrounding. And if students are able to learn based on the things that they can see in the world, it can make just a much better educational experience. Another really amazing project is organized by the Community College Consortium for Open Educational Resources, the Open for Anti-Racism program, which is a professional development program that over a series of weeks was supporting groups of faculty to learn how to build anti-racist practices into their teaching and learning using OER as a platform for that. So it wasn't about OER, it was about anti-racism, but being able to use the fact that open educational resources are open to break down some of the structures within those materials and make them more inclusive and representative of their students. So those are a few examples of OER and projects. I want to talk a little bit about examples of how institutions are leveraging OER. So first, talking about things at the state level. This map represents the states in red are all states that have some kind of state level policy or state funded initiative. And there's also a great resource on the Spark website called the OER State Policy Playbook for those policymakers in the audience and those advocates that provides model language and things that you can do in your state to advocate for this kind of policy. Since we're in New England, I want to make sure to highlight the great work that's happening at the Massachusetts Department of Higher Education's OER Council, just incredible work happening there. Actually, no legislation behind that, and as there is in many states. It was an initiative that was led by advocates in the state and the Department of Higher Ed, working with all of the public higher ed institutions to support OER work. A really, really great example of statewide collaboration and engaging a broad group of stakeholders in shaping the initiative, which is just so important. Bob, Sue, yes. So the other great thing to note is that there is a federal grant program called the Open Textbooks Pilot, which Massachusetts also received a grant on. And this provides grants to support programs that create open textbooks and expand their use. And there are a lot of really great projects that are already supported by it. The last funding round just closed, but we're hoping the program is going to be renewed by Congress next year. So there'll be additional funding. So definitely think about if you have a $1 to $2 million large scale project idea around open textbooks. This is a great program to start thinking about if there's another call for proposals next year. Also, great statewide work happening in Connecticut. The Connecticut OER Coordinating Council was created by legislation in the state. One of the unique things about what's happening in Connecticut is that I believe this includes privates in addition to publics, which I think is very important in a New England context, particularly. Really incredible numbers in terms of the impact that this program is having on students, and another great model for just ensuring collaboration across different institutions in the state, benchmarking, gathering statistics that are standardized, and being able to demonstrate impact to the legislature to hopefully continue renewing funding. Also, shout out to New York. New York is an example of a state that has received really substantial and sustained funding for OER, and I think that really shows in the substantial work that the CUNY system and the SUNY system have done on OER. The two systems have taken different approaches. So it's a good state to look at to sort of see a compare and contrast of different ways of going about OER at a larger scale, but just like really impressive outcomes coming out of New York. And then stepping outside of New England, I want to note in North Dakota, it's a great example of a little going a long way. So the state put $110,000, I think, into an OER grant program. And this is what a lot of states do, is they provide small grants to faculty to use OER. And this program was reviewed by the state auditor, so a very rigorous assessment of the program. And the state auditor found that for every dollar that the state invested in this program, it saves students $10. So like, point me to something in higher ed that does that, like literally. You know, all of the conversations right now about how do we make higher ed affordable, it is all about student loan forgiveness, Pell Grant increases, finding dollars to offset dollars. Tell me where else in higher ed we can actually save students money without spending a dollar for every dollar that's saved. On the policy front, I want to point to Idaho, which just adopted a state board of higher education policy that is a great model policy to look at in terms of providing rigorous definitions for the types of course materials in the models, and thinking about this concept that we're going to hear about a little bit today called course marking, which refers to marking in the course catalog students use for registration, what the cost of the materials they're using is, whether it's free OER or, you know, quote, low cost, although I think we need to be very rigorous about defining low cost. So this is a great model policy to look at. And there's another model out there that you might hear about called ZTC, zero textbook cost, or Z degree. And that refers to programs at institutions where they work to build out OER in every single course along a degree pathway, so that students can literally graduate without spending a single dollar on textbooks and using OER along the way. And there was this substantial grant program run by Achieving the Dream that did support some projects in Massachusetts and Connecticut, and has established a number of these pathways. And California actually just made a huge investment, $115 million in developing ZTC courses. So that's the big picture. Thinking about things on a little bit of a smaller picture, we see on campuses across the country and here in New England too, that libraries are a really key force in driving open education. Librarians are often the people who are sitting down with faculty and saying, like, let's find you OER for your course, or let me help you get this into Pressbooks, which is an online publishing platform, so that you can adapt it for your students. And this is an example of a research guide or a lib guide, you may hear that term. And the purpose of that is to just help campus be able to navigate the OER that's out there. So chances are your campus has one of these, and chances are there is a librarian that knows about OER. So that's a great place to start if you need to start somewhere. I mentioned before that grant programs are something that's very common. So looking at some private institutions, Wheaton College here in Mass is a great example of an OER grant program. It's small, like 10 to 12 faculty a year, provided a little bit of money to adapt, adopt, or create an open textbook, and providing support to them. And Wheaton College was actually just selected for an institute run for the AAC&U, which is a great program that's out there that you might want to look into for your institutions. And then we're also seeing institutions like Bates College with the Rio Center thinking about ways to advance open education in ways that are in line with social justice. So not just looking at this in terms of student savings and taking more a targeted practical approach, but thinking about this as an opportunity to do education better and step away from this world where the rigid textbooks that are produced by centralized bodies based on what they think they can sell, and instead become part of the institution, achieving the institution's mission to build the next generation of leaders and scholars and contributors to our society, and making sure that every single person can participate in that regardless of their background. All right. The statistics show that the OER movement is working. So this is from the latest report by Bayview Analytics. And what this shows is from 2014-15 at the top to 2021-22 at the bottom, the growth in OER awareness. So the number of faculty say that they're aware of OER is now over 50%. And this is using the strictest possible measure for this question. And that is a really significant achievement when you consider it started at 0 20 years ago, right? You know, we still have work to do. Half of faculty is not enough, but it is a really significant progress. And I think every person in this room who has helped contributed to that, and those of you online, should be really proud of this. Similarly, we're starting to see really significant adoption numbers. So I should note that this is not market share. This is the number of faculty who say that they have used OER as a required course in at least, or required material in at least one course. So, but still, it's like when I think back to advocating for this as a student, the idea that 31% of faculty would have assigned an OER as a required material in introductory courses is wild. And like, think about the impact that that's having for those students. It's really significant. There's, again, a really long way to go, but the OER movement is gaining momentum and having an impact. And I think this is a really interesting statistic, which looks at the adoption of OER versus whether the campus has an OER initiative. And what this shows is the darker color is the faculty adoption of OER on campuses with an OER initiative versus without one. So it shows that developing an OER initiative probably is going to increase faculty adoption of OER. So the work we do works. All right, and I also want to note that there has been a lot of really great research done looking at academic outcomes in OER, and showing that it's not just adopting OER to replace expensive textbooks, it's actually supporting students to do better. And even just doing an even trade is worth it. I think it's really important to look at research by Dr. Eddie Watson and others that has found that it, particularly for students who are most likely to face cost and access barriers, Pell eligible students, part-time students, students of color, that they're just or proportionately getting more benefit out of open educational resources, and that's where we should be focusing our time. All right, so I want to wrap up by talking a little bit about the future and how the landscape is currently changing. And there's sort of two futures. So one is the future that's presented by OER, where higher ed thinks about course materials as not a challenge to just be quickly solved and moved on from, but thinks about it as an opportunity to rethink the way that we use course materials in higher education and start thinking about it as part of the digital infrastructure and the courses that we offer, rather than just outsourcing it. The other one looks like this, and a continuation of this into the future. So I showed this graph before, but nothing about the market dynamics has really changed. And this history is going to keep repeating itself unless we make structural changes to the way that materials are used. And the Washington Post called what's happening right now a battle. It's a battle over the cost of course materials and what model is going to dominate in the future. And it was really interesting. I mentioned at the beginning that 2017 was a turning point. And it was a turning point because the textbook industry stopped denying that cost was a problem and stopped denying that OER wouldn't work and started saying, we have the solution, just buy our stuff, buy our discounted digital textbooks. We'll save students money. So this is a press release from McGraw-Hill, one of the 3 largest publishers, saying that they've saved students more than $55 million by charging students automatically for digital textbooks that they chose not to buy when they were available on their own, but I don't understand the logic. But you'll see this kind of messaging, and it's very important to understand what this means. This headline from the Association of American Publishers, the trade association that represents the major publishers, they offer OER. I mean, they do, but you have to pay for access to the platform that OER is in. So I think it's really important to understand some of the things that you're going to be hearing. So I used this term before, inclusive access. You're going to hear this term, and I want you all to think really deeply about this term as you go through today, because we're here talking about equity and inclusion. And this model uses this term, but that is not what this term means. This term refers to inclusive as in terms of an all-inclusive cost. So this model is better described as automatic textbook billing, where the cost of digital course materials automatically billed to students upon registering in the course. I showed you this screenshot earlier of what it looks like to a student. And it's getting worse. So there's that model, and there's a new model that's emerged called equitable access, and think very deeply about this term as well. The Chronicle of Higher Education described this as a health insurance model, where all students pay a flat fee, regardless of whether their faculty have assigned OER, an expensive textbook, and they get all of their materials as part of that. So, in one hand, like, that's how tuition works, right? Regardless of whether they use all of the facilities, regardless of what courses you take generally, you're paying the same. So it's just making textbooks work the same way everything else works. But the challenge is that it's a fee, and it's considered sort of an ancillary course fee rather than a fee that would be governed by the regulations that are in place to ensure that tuition and mandatory fees stay in check. So it's sort of skirting through this little loophole that allows institutions to just charge students for fees and not responding to the accountability measures that are in place to control costs. And on your campuses, it's very likely you're going to hear, if you have a Barnes & Noble bookstore or a Follett bookstore, you're going to hear from these companies about, hey, revenue's declining at my institution. So, here's a great option for increasing revenue. We can just bill your students automatically for their textbooks. We can do a flat fee per credit hour. And to some administrators, that sounds really good. They even claim that you can improve student outcomes if you click that button. You can learn about how it improves student outcomes. It just goes to a contact us form. But we need to be really careful about when we see this language, and not just understanding that it is not used in a way that we understand it, and we're going to be talking about it here today, but that these programs don't accomplish the goals that we need to be thinking about. And this is actually backed up by research. So there was just a large-scale study done in Tennessee on an inclusive access pilot, where they found that there was zero improvement in academic outcomes. And not only that, for all students, but zero improvement for Pell eligible, non-white, and part-time students either. So it's not helping the students who are more likely to face cost and access barriers. So what is the point if it's not doing that? With OER, you're replacing a traditional material with OER, and doing no harm is good. But here, you're just using the same material and getting the same outcomes. That's just the status quo. We're starting to see the publishers put out all of this kind of stuff. Like Pearson just put out a $15 subscription to textbooks. They're trying to make it sound like Netflix. Like if you even look at their website, it even looks like Netflix. And you may hear this kind of thing too, that for $15, it's $15 a month. So that's actually $40 a semester if it's for 4 months. And this is all designed to push us toward digital products that are capturing lots of student data. So we also just need to be really, really careful in thinking about where the traditional market is pushing us and how it benefits them. It's not just about paying for these materials in terms of the cost financially. Students are also starting to pay with their data. And if you're essentially taking the agency away from a student to use a non-digital object and requiring them to accept the terms of service to a textbook that they've been billed for, we need to be really rigorous in understanding the data that's being collected, how vendors are using it, and how that plays into their future business strategy, which is all about workforce skills. So I could say a lot more about that. I am not going to because I need to wrap up. But I do want to quickly note that the state of West Virginia and Texas to some extent just passed legislation requiring transparency for inclusive access programs, requiring them to share the terms of service for digital materials, and also some transparency around fees. So there's a model bill for this on our website. Highly encourage you to consider this in your states. And just to wrap it up, in thinking about the rest of the day, consider what equitable access to course materials means on your campus for your students and work toward that goal. Prioritize OER over other options because it is sustainable and equitable if we make it such. And start thinking about course materials as part of your digital infrastructure and how you make higher education better, not just preserve the status quo. Okay, that's it.